So welcome everybody. Just wanted to introduce myself. You likely got this email invitation from me or forwarded from someone who originally got it from me. I'm Eileen Scully. I am the founder and CEO of the Rising Tides. We are a consulting firm that seeks to make workplaces better for women while also making them better for everyone else as a result of that. Today, we're joined by Dr. Rodney Cohen, who is a scholar and an academic in the HBCU space. Rodney has published 2 books. We've been friends for, what do you think, Rodney, 10 years now? And I thought that this would be a great opportunity to bring him into my network, introduce all of you, not only to him, but also to his body of work, and help you all get a little bit more up to speed on the value and the differentiators of HBCUs. So with that, I just want to roll over to Rodney. If you want to introduce yourself, get a little bit about your background, and then we can go into some of the interview.
Sure. Thank you, Eileen. I want to thank you for hosting this event and hosting me as well. As Eileen said, I have worked significantly in the past around historically Black colleges. I am a graduate of a historically Black college, Clark Atlanta University, which is located in Atlanta, Georgia. My parents were also graduates of Clark as well. So I was introduced at an early age to not only Clark, but to historically Black colleges in general. I later went on to also do further education in graduate work at Western Kentucky and also Vanderbilt University, where I received my doctorate and did my doctoral research actually on historically Black colleges, where I looked at alumni giving, alumni participation, and donations. Following that, I became additionally interested in not only the history, but also the culture and traditions of historically Black colleges, and decided to produce a number of publications in that area, both through journal articles as well as the 2 books that Eileen mentioned there. So that kind of is the background that brings me here today to have this conversation about, one, the significance of historically Black colleges. I think is very timely when we think about some of the press HBCUs have been getting, particularly around the recent election of Kamala Harris, who is our new vice president and a graduate of Howard University.
Thank you, Rodney. So I don't know about the rest of you that are participating in this, but my knowledge of HBCUs came mostly from the Huxtables. So I didn't know HBCUs as a category. My predominantly white neighborhood and upbringing didn't really educate us about the value and the differentiators of those. So I want to have Rodney give us a little bit of background on why and when historically Black colleges were founded. And then we can go into some of the business application of why we want you to start considering and prioritizing graduates from HBCUs.
Sure. One of the questions that we always get is, why do we need historically Black colleges? And I think what is important is to look at the historical foundations of these institutions. As many of you all may be aware, the sojourn of African Americans in this country early on during the enslavement period, it was actually against the law for African Americans, one, to be taught how to read and write. So that persisted into the Civil War in the 1860s and really perpetrated itself, particularly in the Deep South. So in the Deep South, following the Civil War in 1865, African Americans were legally excluded from receiving higher education and were limited in receiving higher education in northern states, although African Americans in limited numbers were allowed to participate in some of the northern institutions early on. It was very limited, and it was encouraged to create quotas in that regard. So as a result, many individuals, both in the white community and the African American community, saw fit to establish institutions as early as 1837, with the first African American institution by the name of Cheney University, which is located in Pennsylvania. In fact, it was started off as the African Institute and was influenced and started by a Quaker in that area. And the Quakers, as you all well know, were very prominent in the abolitionist movement. The first degree granting institution, Eileen, was Lincoln University in Pennsylvania as well, which is right down the road from Cheney. And that was founded in 1854 as Ashman Institute, and later would change its name to Lincoln University in honor of Abraham Lincoln following his assassination. And that, in fact, was the first degree granting institution of higher learning. It was not until about 1865, at the close of the Civil War, that we began to see a number of African-American institutions begin to spring up in the Deep South. Institutions like Atlanta University, Shaw University, Fisk, Spelman, Talladega, we can go on, but these institutions would then begin to be established not only by benevolent philanthropists from the North, but also, Eileen, from African-American institutions such as the Black Church. So we see where the African-American Methodist Church, Episcopal Church were very instrumental in establishing a number of historically Black colleges, along with the Baptist Church and the Freedmen's Bureau, which was actually established by the federal government to help the transition, if you will, of African Americans coming out of the institution of slavery into a free state. Most notably is Howard University and also Atlanta University, along with the American Missionary Association. These institutions were established to help these newly freed individuals, one, gain skill sets that would not only benefit them individually, but also the communities that they would be serving.
Sure. So do you want to talk a little bit about federal support for HBCUs? Talk a little bit about how many of those schools that were founded back in the 1860s and 1870s are still thriving today, and how they've grown, and how many HBCUs there are now in the United States? Sure.
You will sometimes see varying numbers between 101 and 107 institutions. But we have about 101 historically Black colleges today. In the 1930s, we had as many as 121. And those institutions, as I mentioned earlier, range from northern states down to the Deep South, primarily the lion's share in the Deep South. We have a bifurcation of institutions. We have a number of private institutions and a number of state-funded institutions. Many of those state-funded institutions that I didn't mention earlier were a result of the Morrill Act. In 1862, there was the first Morrill Act, and in the 1890s, there was a second that basically established agricultural colleges for the African-American community and for white America as well. Now, part of that is that many of the state schools in the South that were state-funded, Eileen, they were given two choices. Part of receiving federal grants, meaning the majority state institutions, was to admit African Americans. And if not, they had to set up a separate, as we know, what we call separate but equal institution. Now, many times, although those institutions were established, the equal part did not exist. So when you talk about funding, you're talking about institutions that have been high producers for over 180 years, but have been, in many regards, grossly underfunded. In fact, many majority institutions are looking at these HBCUs and have tried to determine how have they been able to produce high-level products with such limited resources. But with that being said, many of the historical Black colleges now are receiving the attention that they so longly deserve, and are now receiving more resources, not only from the state government, from the federal government, but also from philanthropists that we're seeing now that are giving in the millions of dollars in those sums that somewhat equivalent to some of their majority counterparts. Not quite at the level, but we're now beginning to see that, yes.
Yeah, I think the most notable, right, was Mackenzie Scott recently, yes. A tremendous gift to a number of Black medical colleges, correct?
Right, and also too, Eileen, to that regard, in my research is around African-American alumni giving. And because, you took generations of African Americans to, in a large swath, to begin to acquire a significant amount of wealth, we're now seeing a good number of African American philanthropists significantly donating to institutions such as Robert Smith,
Yeah.
basically wiped the debt of a graduating class at Morehouse College. And Oprah Winfrey, of course, has a stellar record. Camille Cosby, made a sizable gift to Spelman. So we're now beginning to see not only the alumni of those institutions, but also members of the African American community with significant wealth who now see the need to really support those institutions, whether they were alum or not.
Yeah, and I think that that's probably a good segue to what we're going to talk about next, which is, let's talk about what unique characteristics students at HBCUs develop that become lifetime attributes. So we talk about leaders, and we talk about the people that graduate from HBCUs, even though HBCUs, Black colleges, are only 3% of all four-year colleges, nonprofit colleges.
Sure.
Alumni are 80% of the Black judges and 50% of the Black lawyers and doctors, right? So you've got a tradition of excellence that is really the purpose for this webinar. And let's help my corporate clients and my colleagues understand the untapped potential that is available to them just by prioritizing and understanding a little bit better the type of a graduate that is produced by an HBCU experience. So can you talk about that a little bit, Rodney?
That is an excellent point. So in the 1950s and 60s, Eileen, again, due to discriminatory practices in the country, almost the majority of African Americans attended historically Black colleges. But as we began to move towards the desegregation, we began to see African Americans having opportunities at a number of other institutions and this matriculation. So you brought up a good point. Although historically Black colleges are enrolling a significantly lower number of African Americans, they're producing at a higher rate. In fact, over 80% of African Americans with PhDs in the sciences receive their undergraduate degrees at a historically Black college. Approximately 75% of our military officers and flag officers receive their undergraduate degree from historically Black colleges. So again, those who have been familiar with historically Black colleges since their inception understand those values in that environment. But that environment, Eileen, as you hinted towards, is actually rooted in the history of these institutions. Now, although we define them as historically Black colleges and they were designed to educate African Americans, these institutions at their start were not discriminatory in nature. In fact, if we look at Atlanta University, when it was founded in 1865, was an integrated institution. Many of the Northern faculty who came down from some of the Ivy League institutions actually sent their children to that school. In fact, the state of Georgia said, look, if you do not stop this integrated environment, we're going to stop the state funding from that. So when we think about what is the unique environment of these institutions, we think about its founding. So what the environment is, one is it's a very diverse environment. So when you hear historically Black, we think that it's a monolithic environment, which it is not. The institutions have historically been inclusive. They understood that, that the history of those institutions, that they wanted to be inclusive. And also, too, there's an affordability factor as well. They tend to be less costly than their majority institution peers. So they become very attractive to a lot of students. One, in some regards, we have institutions where students are afforded an opportunity, Eileen, that might not be able to get into other institutions, but we have high performing and highly selective HBCUs as well. that also provide an opportunity of students who could have gone to a Stanford or a Yale undergrad, such as Kamala Harris, who chose to go to a HBCU because of that environment.
Yeah.
You got to think about now that African-American students who have the opportunity to participate in education at the primary level, some of them are participating in institutions where they don't see a teacher or a student that looks like them. And then when they get on the campus of a historically Black college, now they afford the opportunity to receive education and instruction, encouragement, mentoring, and counseling from individuals that look like them, and also individuals that don't look like them as well. So they're able to be in a rich environment that is very diverse, very inclusive, and very encouraging. So what we find also too, Eileen, to your point, is that being in this environment, many of those students at a large percentage are put in leadership roles. Yep. And the one thing that they do not have to think about is the environment that they're in, that their success is based on their success and operating in that sector.
You want to talk a little bit too, Rodney, about you're describing these students in such a way that I'm led to believe that a higher, and correct me if I'm wrong, a higher percentage of HBCU students may be first generation college students. Is that true? Because I know that we have, and I know you personally, and I know a lot of the schools you talk about also have a strong legacy component, but I know that in the predominantly white institutions, legacy is something that is valued mostly for the endowment and donation aspect of the college university experience. But can you talk about first generation students at HBCUs and how they are positioned to be more successful at an HBCU than maybe at another institution?
That's a great point. So one of the things I want to point out is that when we say historically Black colleges and universities, we're talking about institutions. Number one, that designation came about in 1964, Eileen, or 65 with the Higher Education Act. Prior to that, at the beginning, many of those institutions in the 1800s were referred to either as an African school. Then as time went on, they became colored institutions, and then they became Negro institutions. So in the 1960s, we began to change our vernacular and how we identified as a community. The term historically Black colleges and universities came in the mid 60s. So I just wanted to point that out. And that is coming from the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges. So to that point, all of the historically Black colleges is not created equal, just like at predominantly white institutions. So you have very highly selective institutions, like a Spelman, for example. There was one report one year where it was more difficult for a student who applied there to get in Spelman than it was to get in Harvard College at that particular time. And then you have some institutions who are totally open admissions, so it is, trying to provide an opportunity to individuals, and we're going to bring you here and we're going to take you from where you are and take you to where you need to be. And there are a number of examples. In fact, there was a renowned judge who recently talked about coming out of high school, he could barely read. And this historically Black college gave him an opportunity and nurtured him. So there is still, even in the highly selective institutions, there's still that responsibility of providing opportunities for first generation college students. And we do see a high level of first generation college students attending these institutions and being very successful. And when we talk about attrition rate, as an example, attrition rate is something that is a big concern in higher education in general. And what we find out is that one of the main reasons that we find attrition at some of these historically Black colleges is around finances. And finances is across the board, and that's why it is now important that these institutions really beef up their opportunity to provide scholarships and endow scholarships for their students. But to your point, the first generation piece is something that many of these HBCUs are proud of and continue that tradition.
Yeah, I think an example of that, I don't know how many of you on the call watch the Skip Gates Finding Your Roots program, but there's a new series of episodes coming out. One of them profiles Ruth Simmons. And I think that she's an outstanding example of someone who is a first generation college graduate who has done remarkable things. She was, I'll actually turn it over to Rodney, but she's an academic and she's had an amazing career. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Ruth Simmons. Yeah, no, that's a great point, Eileen. Ruth Simmons, as she mentioned, was she's a graduate of Dillard University in Louisiana, was from Texas. I believe came from a family of sharecroppers, many siblings, and would go on to become the first African-American president of an Ivy League school. She was president of Brown University. And now, which is apropos to our conversation, nearing her retirement, if you will, she chose to give back, if you will, and she is now president of Prairie View University down in Texas, right outside of Houston, which is a historically Black college that is very well known in engineering and technology. So Ruth Simmons is an example of that, of an institution like Dillard providing an opportunity to an individual who may not at that time been able to attend another institutions, either for finances or other family reasons.
Yeah. So it's worth watching that episode if any of you have it on PBS or Hulu to find and learn a little bit about Ruth Simmons. I think it's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
So I think now let's move into the business benefit of all of this, Rodney. If you want to talk about, well, we didn't talk about Greek fraternities and sororities, which I know became a really big topic during the primaries with Kamala Harris, and then certainly moving into the election and the inauguration of her. But if you want to, let's back up a little bit. And I'd love for you to help us distinguish the value also of Black fraternities and sororities in a way that sets them apart from the traditional, that's not the right word, but the non-Black fraternities and sororities in terms of how they groom people to be leaders and to have lifelong service commitments in their lives. Because a lot of people participate in those Greek organizations without attending a historically Black college, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. In fact, that's an excellent point. The historical Black fraternities and sororities actually grew out of Cornell University in 1906 with Alpha Phi Alpha, which is the oldest and first African-American fraternity that is still long-standing. There were a couple other fraternities that were established before that, but they were short-lived. One at Indiana University in 1903 by the name of Alpha Kappa Nu, and a couple others at historically Black colleges. But those institutions, Eileen, similar to historically Black colleges, were established because of exclusionary practices. And the purpose, the primary purpose of Alpha, as an example, at Cornell University, was not to necessarily throw a frat party or do those things, but was to bring those small number of African-American men at the time there in closer contact with one another to support their studies and to provide social support. We would then move on and we would see the growth of Black fraternities crop up at Indiana University with the second established organization in the name of Kappa Alpha Psi. And then we saw at Howard University, as there began a flowering of institutions such as Omega Psi Phi Alpha Kappa Alpha that Kamala Harris is a member of, and others that were established at Howard University. As individuals graduated from college, either at a majority institution or historically Black college, as you mentioned, those organizations exist on both of those campuses since the early 1900s. Those organizations saw fit to carry on the tradition and the legacy of service and community support, relief, and philanthropy.
Yep.
So that's why you see a lot of the individuals such as myself, I belong to one of those organizations. It has become a lifelong commitment to not only support each other, but also support the community. And it has also been a commitment to support historically Black colleges as well. Many of these organizations have endowments at several of these institutions and also at majority institutions as well. We talk about Robert Smith, an African-American billionaire. He's a member of Alpha Phi Alpha and also a big supporter of HBCUs as well as communities. So that's an example of what you're talking about. So basically, those fraternal and sorority organizations basically took on the spirit, if you will, of the historically Black colleges and became a vehicle to provide service and also leadership. So one of the things that we see in many of those fraternities, which really lines up with the mission of historically Black colleges, is creating a pipeline for leadership. When you look at all the organizations, one of their prominent objectives or cardinal principles is scholarship, leadership, achievement. Many of these institutions are really interested in developing young people, not only in college, but after they get out of college as well. And there's established a number of partnerships with corporations as well to participate and become partners in that effort.
So when I work with clients, one of the big topics that we cover is changing your organization through the process of mentoring and sponsoring, right? Where sponsoring requires that someone with some level of power in the organization find and nurture and bring through someone who's at an earlier stage in their career. For me, this seems like a perfect way to nurture and grow your sponsor program by tapping into what people who have graduated from HBCUs or people who are members of these Greek organizations have learned. Because if they're learning through that experience how to effectively pull other people up and through challenging situations, that's a perfect play in any organization, right?
That is correct. That is correct. And I would encourage those on the call, if your organization is not connected or partner, this is an opportunity, as Eileen said, to think about strategic ways to partner either with the Historical Black College or with one of the organizations that we discussed here as well. And there are already, test proven pipelines and partnerships that exist. So it's just a matter of connecting and continuing in that fashion.
Yeah, and some of that I think is I see a lot of the technology companies building some of those relationships because obviously everything in business relates to having a technology acumen. But I think that a lot of it also is location based. So you and I have talked about the density of Black colleges in Atlanta and how so many companies are starting to see that and starting to locate campuses there and build some pipeline programs there. What I want people to understand is it's not just a recruitment strategy that we're talking about here. It's a development strategy. So right now, I'm fairly certain that you have some leaders or some high potential people in your organization who are graduates of these universities or members of these Greek organizations that you can fast track into leadership because you didn't know that they were graduates of these organizations. It makes them a higher potential candidate.
And that is one of the conversations that we tend to have when we do these kind of presentations with organizations. And we find, Eileen, to your point, is that many of the organizations were not aware that in their C-suites or, MD roles that they were graduates of historically Black colleges. It just passed them by. So one, making one aware of those individuals who made a significant impact to your organization. I mean, we see now where the newly minted CEO of Walgreens is a HBCU graduate of Spelman College and a few other organizations as well. So I think you're right. I think one, we need to identify those internally and figure out, who are those individuals that are members, one, of these organizations that we talked about, that are involved in the leadership, mentoring, and development. And also, two, those individuals that may be a graduate of a historically Black college. either as an undergrad or as a graduate as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think if we can start talking about the Spelman degree in the same way we talk about an Ivy League degree, when you look at the women that come through and out of Spelman and the excellence that that organization is producing, it's an untapped potential for a lot of organizations.
So one of the things I want to point out to that comment you just made, which is very on point, is that I want to remind everyone and remind us that we have 101 historically Black colleges. So, you know, the media now, and I get it, has picked up on the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 most notable institutions that we talk about. But there are a number of historically Black colleges doing excellent work and have some interesting niches that I think that a lot of organizations are beginning to identify and tap into. I mean, you think about Xavier University in New Orleans, for example. I mean, they've been the leading producer of African Americans going to medical school for the last 20, 25, 30 years running. I mean, you look at an institution like Clark Atlanta University has historically produced more African American PhDs than Harvard and the University of Michigan over the years. So not only the institution as a brand at broad, but as we begin to drill down, Eileen, and say, what are those different disciplines as you talked about? You know, who's doing things now in cybersecurity, which these institutions are getting into? What's going on in technology, for example? What's going on in agribusiness? And to emphasize your point, most recently it's been identified that a major technology hub, which is going to be in the form of a structure or a campus, if you will, is going to be placed in Atlanta, Georgia, Eileen, but it is going to be a hub and a campus supported by technology institutions, but it's going to also involve historically Black colleges all over the country. Yeah. So it's going to maximize the collaboration and the partnership that's going to go far beyond just its Atlanta location.
So for those of you on the call who are in tech companies that are smaller and not able to make these investments, you probably can tap into these graduates and benefit from the investment that your competitors or these larger companies are able to make, right? That's another really great benefit to everyone. I don't think Google's doing this just for Google, right? Google's doing this to elevate everyone. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I believe recently, as an example, I gave a talk to an informatics organization, and they were having trouble identifying. And one of the things that we put together is what you're doing now is to begin to identify those HBCUs that are actually training people in that area that they were unaware of.
Yeah.
Secondly, too, I wanted to point out Wells Fargo recently made an interesting announcement. Their CEO talked about his or their inability to identify African-American talent. So now Wells Fargo, because he was tapped on the shoulder, if you will, and say, look, we got 101 institutions producing excellent folk in finance and business and what have you. So now Wells Fargo is investing and partnering with a number of historically Black colleges begin to help identify and mine some of that talent. So,
and probably Walgreens is going to be next in line to make those kind of investments with Rosalind Brewer now being their CEO, right?
Exactly.
That's
right.
cool. Yeah, that's great.
I mean, and going back to what you talked about, environment, there's been a number of studies done on the institutions in terms of productivity.
Yeah.
And they find that in organizations, those are individuals who tend to come out of HBCUs, tend to exhibit higher levels of commitment, higher levels of inclusion and cooperation with their colleagues, and also leadership skills as well. Those things have been qualified and quantified as well. So it's important for us to think about that as well. And one of the resources I would direct everyone to is the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges. They provide a lot of statistics and a lot of data, and they do a lot of scholarship and pour down information that's very valuable to talk about and think about these HBCUs. Yeah. Also, too, you also want to think about as a resource the Thurgood Marshall Fund. Yeah. That is the organization, Eileen, that represents all of the state-supported institutions. Okay. Such as Grambling, Florida A&M, Kentucky State, Delaware State, Delaware State, in fact, is an institution that has long been supported by President Biden. You know, obviously he's in Delaware and he's been a big fan and supporter of Delaware State. Also, you want to look at the United Negro College Fund, which primarily represents the private institutions. So those are great resources. Not only do they provide funding and scholarship, but they also provide a wealth of knowledge, Eileen, based in research, in numbers and that sort of thing as well. So, right. So those are three great resources I would direct everyone to take a look at.
Excellent. Excellent. So if there are, we had a couple questions come in prior to this session, and I see that we have at least one that's come in during the session. If you have any questions right now, we're going to shift to that. And Tammy Ellen, who's our amazing producer behind the boards, is going to field those for us. So thank you, Tammy.
Sure. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Rodney. It's great. I learned a lot. So this question came in from Richard Fouts in the chat. So he's on the call. Throughout my career, I've always found creativity to be every organization's scarcest resource. In my last job, the diverse teams, culturally and racially, were higher performing than those that were more homogeneous. Can HBCU hiring be a measurable component of a manager's goal to grow the organization's creative resource?
Oh, indeed. I would encourage that. In fact, many organizations are moving in that regard. And going back to one of the points that Eileen brought up is that now organizations are highlighting those who've moved to senior level positions, like the Rosalind Brewers, like the CEO of Chuck Taylor, as an example, and I could go on, and looking at identifying those and measuring those, Tammy, who are in the ranks at those senior level executive positions.
Yeah, but I think the point is absolutely been proven out that the more diverse your team is, the better the product and solution you're going to produce for the organization, right? And the fewer mistakes you're going to make going to market in terms of misrepresenting or misstating or missing your mark on what your product actually is and who it serves, right? I have an example in my book of a gentleman in the venture capital world who was shopping around looking for investors because he had a great new business model for how to sell weaves for Black women's hair. Go to all these, mostly white male venture capital firms, and they did not understand or see what that market need was because they were too homogeneous. But then he went to the gentleman I profiled in my book, Lo Tony, and Lo said, this is huge. This is a game changer, and invested in it. And now it's a really viable, popular, sustainable, profitable business. So it just takes a different perspective on things, and maybe having more people with those perspectives at your tables is going to benefit your organization. Absolutely.
So also to add to that, Eileen, when we talk about diversity, I want people to really think about the diverse experience that a student receives at a historically Black college. It's very different than students at a majority school. So what do I mean by that? Even at an institution, let's say where 85% or 90% of the student body is African American, the difference is many of those students will take classes and interact with professionals, administrators, and faculty who may be 45% non-Black, versus an individual who goes to a majority school and they can spend their entire educational career and maybe have one faculty of color in that regard, or go through their entire career and not have to interact with someone from a diverse or different background. So again, I want to point out that although these institutions are deemed as historically Black because of their history, they're very diverse. In fact, when you look at the total number of students at historically Black college, almost close to 30% are non-Black. In fact, we have about 6 or 7 historically Black colleges that are majority white now, like West Virginia State,
wow.
which is HBCU, is 92% white students. Bluefield State in West Virginia. The young lady, if you all remember the movie, what's the movie, Eileen? NASA.
Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures. if you remember Hidden Figures, one of these scientists and mathematicians in there, Katherine Johnson, she's a graduate of West Virginia State, which was West Virginia College in Charleston. But now it's a majority white institution, but it's still a historical Black college, you know. And those students are proud to be there and proud of the history and understand the tradition there. So
there was recently, I don't know how many of you saw this going on Twitter, it was probably a week or two ago, and somebody asked, how old were you when you had your first Black teacher? And it was so interesting to see people's responses, because many responses were, I'm still waiting. I have not. Right? And it's a fascinating question to think about, right? No matter who you are and what your background is. So that's great.
Yeah. And to that point, I want to emphasize the history is very important, because right after World War II, Eileen, many of the Jewish intellectuals who fled from Germany, when they came to America, the one place they could get a job as an intellectual, as an academic, was historically Black colleges.
Love it. Yeah.
So you have folk like Albert Einstein, who was a regular lecturer at Lincoln University, Pennsylvania. So this, again, was a tradition of HBCUs being open and welcoming to folks from all over, whether they were Jewish immigrants from India, China, Africa, African American, whatever have you. These were institutions that provided an opportunity not only for students, also provided an opportunity for faculty and academics as well.
That's great. That's great. Tammy, were there other questions? Do we have time? I wanted to end up at about 3:45 and give everybody a few extra minutes on your schedule today, but if there's another question, it would be great.
This is a good one that came in prior to the call. Yeah. In addition to recruiting, what other things can my company do to elevate the perception and understanding of HBCUs internally?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So the obvious answer is, you know, we can bring Rodney in and talk to your executives and really tap into not only the information we've shared today, but we can personalize it and customize it to your organization and your needs, right? So whatever your goals are, we can have that conversation and help you understand. But I think that starting with having conversations like this and doing a little bit of your own research on, like we said, Rosalind Brewer is an outstanding example of someone that went through a historically Black college. Kamala Harris, an outstanding example. Look at the people that are making investments in these schools, and really try to push your organization not only to make investments if they can, but to really prioritize these graduates in the same way they do other very popular schools that are almost over-indexed in leadership.
And one of the things I would suggest and encourage is to survey your organization and find out who in your organization is a graduate of an HBCU. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm sorry, you have one really good comment here from Elizabeth. We are ready to welcome these outstanding candidates. We have tried to reach out to HBCU schools individually, found it difficult to get a response. How do we reach out to these institutions to make our opportunities available to students and graduates?
Elizabeth, that is a great question, and that's one that comes up a lot. And I'm so happy to see you here. We haven't talked in a while, so thank you for joining us today. But I'm going to punt that over to Rodney to answer.
Well, as Eileen said, one good way is to connect with the rising tides. But and another way is to also, again, as I say, survey and identify graduates of those members in your organization who are graduates, and they can also have a leeway in the inroads into the institutions that they've served. That's very impactful as well.
Yeah, so it's probably, Elizabeth, it's probably a combination of your organization not being a proven known entity, and the people that you're contacting may be getting a lot of contact from the outside right now that they're not ready to respond to, or that they don't know how to prioritize. So we can certainly help with that. So just let me know where you're targeting, and we can help make it happen.
They're coming in now. This is from Berku. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that the right way. As the oldest HBCU in North Carolina, Fayetteville State University has been establishing partnerships, talent pipelines, and we are looking forward to partner with you all.
There you go. Slam dunk, Elizabeth. Perfect.
I know Fayetteville State well. Great partners with the military. Fort Bragg, excellent institution. The Broncos do a good job.
That's great.
Yes.
I joke with everybody that Rodney is a walking HBCU encyclopedia. So I dare you to find a school that he doesn't have some information on. So thank you everyone for joining us. We have recorded this session. And so once we edit it and clean it up a little bit, we'll be happy to send it out to you. Please be in touch if there's anything we can do to help further this in your organizations. And I wish you all a wonderful day.
Eileen, I think you wanted to mention the book.
Oh, see, I knew I was going to do that. So if anybody sends an email after this to me, Eileen@therisingtides.com, we're going to do a drawing for a signed copy of Rodney's book, The Black Colleges of Atlanta. So you'll get a hand-scribbled book in the mail from Dr. Cohen. So thank you for reminding me. I knew I would forget that. I knew it. So thank you, everyone. We'll send a follow-up email. Have a great day.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Extraordinaire.